Throughout human history, invisible enemies have reshaped civilizations, toppled empires, and claimed billions of lives. Tonight, we journey through every major pandemic ever recorded, from ancient plagues to modern outbreaks, ranked by their devastating toll. Some numbers will stagger you, others will haunt you long after you drift off. Every pandemic in history, ranked by death toll. Vertical bar sleep documentary, Intro. Throughout the span of human civilization, no force has shaped the course of history quite like infectious disease. Wars have been won and lost not by superior strategy, but by the unseen pathogens that swept through armies before a single sword was raised. Empires that seemed invincible have crumbled not under the weight of rebellion, but beneath waves of fever and suffering that emptied their cities and silenced their markets. The story of humanity is, in many ways, the story of our relationship with disease. A relationship marked by catastrophe, adaptation, and the slow accumulation of knowledge that has allowed us to survive. Tonight, we examine the 10 deadliest pandemics in recorded history, ranked by their estimated death tolls. The task of ranking such events requires careful consideration of what we mean by a pandemic, a term derived from the Greek words pan, meaning all, and demos, meaning people. A pandemic, by definition, is an epidemic that has spread across multiple countries or continents, affecting a substantial portion of the global population. This distinguishes pandemics from localized outbreaks or regional epidemics, which, while devastating to specific communities, did not achieve the geographical reach necessary for inclusion on this list. Our ranking considers both absolute death tolls and, where historical records permit, the proportion of affected populations lost to each disease. In cases where estimates vary widely, as they often do for events that occurred before modern record-keeping, we have relied upon the most widely accepted figures from contemporary epidemiological and historical research. The pandemics we will examine tonight span nearly 2 millennia of human history, from the ancient world to the present day. They include diseases caused by bacteria, viruses, and parasites. Some spread through contaminated water, others through respiratory droplets, and still others through the bites of infected fleas. What unites them is the scale of their impact. Each of these 10 events claimed at least 1 million lives, and several claimed tens of millions. The highest entries on this list reshaped the demographics of entire continents and altered the trajectory of human civilization itself. As we move through this ranking from lowest to highest death toll, you will notice that the numbers grow steadily more difficult to comprehend. The human mind struggles to grasp suffering on such a scale, yet understanding these events remains essential, for they reveal not only the fragility of human societies, but also the resilience that has allowed our species to endure. Item 1. Third Cholera Pandemic. Our examination begins with the Third Cholera Pandemic, which swept across the world between 1846 and 1860, claiming an estimated 1 million lives. To understand this pandemic, we must first understand cholera itself, a disease caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholerae, which thrives in contaminated water and spreads with devastating efficiency through communities lacking adequate sanitation. The disease attacks the small intestine, causing severe diarrhea and vomiting that can lead to fatal dehydration within hours of the first symptoms. A person who wakes feeling healthy may be dead by nightfall. This terrifying speed of progression made cholera one of the most feared diseases of the 19th century, and its repeated global outbreaks shaped public health policy in ways that still influence our world today. The third cholera pandemic originated, like its predecessors, in the Ganges Delta region of the Indian subcontinent. This area, with its dense population, warm climate, and extensive network of rivers and waterways, provided ideal conditions for Vibrio cholerae to flourish. The first two cholera pandemics had followed similar patterns, emerging from India, spreading along trade routes, and eventually reaching Europe and the Americas. But the third pandemic would prove more extensive and more deadly than either of its predecessors, reaching populations that had previously been spared and returning with renewed fury to cities that believed themselves prepared. By 1846, cholera had already killed hundreds of thousands across Asia, and the conditions were ripe for another global outbreak. The expansion of international trade, the growth of urban populations, and the movement of British colonial administrators and soldiers across vast distances all contributed to the disease's spread. The pandemic reached Europe in 1847, spreading rapidly through Russia before moving westward into Germany, France, and eventually Great Britain. In London, the disease found a city utterly unprepared for its arrival. The British capital in the mid-19th century was a study in contrasts. Immense wealth existing alongside desperate poverty, grand architecture rising above streets that served as open sewers. The city's water supply came from the Thames River, into which the waste of nearly 3 million people flowed untreated. When cholera arrived, it spread through the city's poorest neighborhoods with terrible efficiency. The Soho district of London would become the site of one of the most important investigations in the history of public health, an investigation that would fundamentally change our understanding of how diseases spread. Dr. John Snow was a London physician who had become convinced that cholera spread not through foul air, as most of his contemporaries believed, but through contaminated water. The prevailing medical theory of the time held that diseases like cholera were caused by miasma, poisonous vapors rising from rotting organic matter. This miasma theory seemed logical enough. Cholera outbreaks did tend to occur in areas that smelled terrible, and the connection between filth and disease was obvious to anyone who witnessed the conditions in London's slums. But Snow believed the correlation was not causation. He observed that cholera affected the digestive system, not the lungs, which suggested the disease entered the body through ingestion rather than inhalation. He had published his theory in 1849, but it had gained little traction among his peers. The Soho outbreak of 1854 would give him the evidence he needed. On August 31st, 1854, a severe outbreak of cholera began in the Soho neighborhood surrounding Broad Street. Within 3 days, 127 people had died. Within 10 days, the death toll had risen to over 500. Residents who could afford to flee did so, leaving behind those too poor or too sick to escape. Snow, who lived nearby, began investigating immediately. He went door to door, interviewing survivors and family members of the deceased, documenting where each victim had obtained their drinking water. What he found was striking. The deaths clustered heavily around a single water pump located on Broad Street. Of the 83 deaths in one particular area, 73 of the deceased had been known to drink water from the Broad Street pump. Snow also noted curious exceptions that supported his theory. A workhouse near the pump had its own well and reported few deaths. A brewery whose workers drank beer rather than water lost no employees to the disease. Armed with this evidence, Snow presented his findings to the local Board of Guardians on September 7, 1854. He argued that the Broad Street pump was the source of the outbreak and urged them to remove its handle to prevent further use. The board was skeptical, but agreed to the measure. The next day, the pump handle was removed. The outbreak was already subsiding by this point. Most susceptible residents had either died or fled. But Snow's investigation marked a turning point in epidemiological science. He had demonstrated that careful observation and data collection could identify the source of an outbreak, even without understanding the precise mechanism of disease transmission. The bacterium that causes cholera would not be identified until 1854 by Italian anatomist Filippo Pacini, and would not be widely accepted as the cause until Robert Koch's work in 1884. Snow's methodology, however, had established the foundation for modern epidemiology. The third cholera pandemic continued to ravage populations worldwide throughout the 1850s. In Russia, the disease killed over 1 million people between 1847 and 1851 alone. In Spain, approximately 236,000 deaths were recorded during a single year. The pandemic reached North America in 1848, spreading through port cities and following the routes of westward expansion. In the United States, cholera traveled along the Mississippi River and the overland trails used by settlers moving west. Gold seekers heading to California in 1849 carried the disease with them, and cholera claimed more lives along the trail than any other cause. Estimates suggest that between 6,000 and 12,000 people died of cholera on the overland trails during the height of the gold rush. The movement of immigrants played a crucial role in spreading cholera across the Atlantic. Ships carrying migrants from Europe to America became floating incubators for the disease. Conditions aboard immigrant vessels were often horrific. Hundreds of passengers crowded into poorly ventilated holds, sharing limited water supplies and sanitation facilities. When cholera broke out aboard ship, it could spread through the entire passenger complement within days. Ships arriving at American ports sometimes carried more dead than living passengers. Quarantine measures were implemented at major ports, but enforcement was inconsistent, and the economic pressure to keep ships moving often overcame public health concerns. The treatment available to cholera patients during the third pandemic was limited and often counterproductive. Physicians, still operating under miasma theory, focused on purging what they believed to be poisonous substances from the body, prescribing purgatives and emetics that only accelerated the fatal dehydration that characterized the disease. Bleeding was also commonly employed, further weakening patients who were already struggling to survive. Some physicians experimented with intravenous saline solutions to replace lost fluids, and these treatments showed promise, but they were not widely adopted. The mortality rate for cholera patients remained devastatingly high, often exceeding 50%. The legacy of the third cholera pandemic extended far beyond its immediate death toll. The outbreak convinced municipal authorities across Europe and North America that investment in public sanitation was not merely a matter of comfort, but of survival. In London, the Great Stink of 1858, when the smell from the polluted Thames became so overwhelming that Parliament could barely function, finally prompted action. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette was commissioned to design and build a comprehensive sewer system for the city. His network of intercepting sewers, pumping stations and treatment works transformed London's relationship with waste and water. Similar projects followed in cities across the industrialized world. The understanding that contaminated water spread disease, an understanding that emerged directly from the third cholera pandemic, drove one of the greatest public health improvements in human history. Cholera, of course, did not disappear after the third pandemic. 4 more global cholera pandemics would follow during the 19th and 20th centuries. The disease remains endemic in parts of Africa, Asia, and the Americas today, causing an estimated 1.3 to 4 million cases and 21,000 to 143,000 deaths annually. But the death tolls of subsequent outbreaks have been dramatically reduced by the sanitation infrastructure and medical understanding that emerged from the catastrophe of the 1840s and 1850s. The third cholera pandemic ranks first on our list, or rather at the bottom of our ranking, with an estimated 1 million deaths. This number, while staggering, represents the smallest toll among the 10 events we will examine tonight. Item 2. Asian flu. The second entry on our ranking brings us forward 1 century to the Asian flu pandemic of 1957 and 1958, which claimed between 1 and 2 million lives worldwide. This pandemic was caused by a new strain of influenza A virus, designated H2N2, which emerged in East Asia and spread rapidly across the globe in an era when international air travel was transforming the speed at which both people and pathogens could move between continents. The Asian flu pandemic was the first to occur in the age of modern virology, allowing scientists to identify, study, and respond to the virus in ways that had been impossible during earlier influenza outbreaks. Yet despite these advances, the pandemic still exacted a devastating toll. The first documented cases of the Asian flu occurred in Guizhou Province, China, in February 1957. The virus spread rapidly through southern China during the spring, reaching Hong Kong by April. Hong Kong, then a British Crown colony and a major hub of international commerce, served as the jumping-off point for the virus's spread beyond Asia. The city's position at the crossroads of East and West made it an ideal location for a pandemic to gain global reach. Travelers arriving from Hong Kong carried the virus to Singapore, Taiwan, Japan, and beyond. By May, the disease had reached India, Australia, and Indonesia. By June, cases were being reported in the Middle East, Africa, and Europe. The virus that caused the Asian flu was identified remarkably quickly by the standards of the time. Dr. Maurice Hilleman, a microbiologist working at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research in Washington, D.C., obtained samples of the virus from a Navy doctor who had collected throat swabs from patients in Hong Kong. Hilleman analyzed the virus and realized immediately that it was unlike any influenza strain currently circulating in human populations. This meant that most people would have no immunity to it whatsoever. Hilleman understood that a pandemic was inevitable and that only a massive vaccination effort could blunt its impact. He immediately contacted pharmaceutical manufacturers and urged them to begin producing vaccine. The vaccine development effort that followed was unprecedented in its speed and scale. Hilleman's laboratory provided seed virus to 6 pharmaceutical companies, which began mass production in June 1957. By the time the pandemic peaked in the United States that autumn, approximately 40 million doses of vaccine had been distributed. This achievement was remarkable by any measure. Vaccine development that typically took years had been compressed into months. Yet 40 million doses were not nearly enough to protect the entire American population, let alone the global community. The vaccine arrived too late and in insufficient quantities to prevent the pandemic's worst effects. The Asian flu arrived in the United States in late June 1957, carried by participants returning from a Boy Scout jamboree in California and by delegates attending a conference in Iowa. The virus spread quickly but quietly through the summer months, establishing footholds in communities across the country. When schools reopened in September, the pandemic exploded. Children, who spend their days in close contact with dozens of peers, proved to be highly efficient transmitters of the virus. Absentee rates in some school districts exceeded 50%. The wave of childhood infections then spread to families and communities, and by October 1957, the pandemic had reached its peak intensity. The death toll in the United States ultimately reached approximately 116,000, with the majority of deaths occurring during 2 distinct waves, the first in October 1957 and the second in early 1958. The pattern of mortality differed from typical seasonal influenza in troubling ways. While seasonal flu typically claims its victims among the very young and the elderly, the Asian flu showed elevated mortality rates among young adults and middle-aged individuals. Pregnant women were particularly vulnerable, with mortality rates several times higher than in the general population. This pattern echoed the notorious 1918 Spanish flu pandemic and suggested that the H2N2 virus was triggering harmful immune responses in otherwise healthy individuals. Hospitals across the United States struggled to cope with the surge in patients. Many facilities were forced to postpone elective surgeries and cancel routine appointments to make room for influenza patients. Nursing staff worked double shifts, and medical students were pressed into service to fill gaps in coverage. Some hospitals set up overflow wards in hallways and waiting rooms. The situation was particularly dire in urban areas, where population density facilitated rapid transmission and healthcare systems quickly became overwhelmed. The pandemic's impact extended far beyond the healthcare system. Workplace absenteeism reached levels that disrupted essential services and industrial production. Some factories reported that 1/3 of their workers were absent simultaneously. Postal services were delayed. Garbage collection fell behind schedule. Schools that remained open often did so with skeleton staffs, combining classes and cancelling extracurricular activities. The economic impact, while difficult to quantify precisely, was substantial. The Asian flu pandemic prompted significant improvements in global disease surveillance and pandemic preparedness. The World Health Organization, established only 9 years earlier in 1948, coordinated international response efforts and facilitated the sharing of viral samples and epidemiological data across national boundaries. The Global Influenza Surveillance Network, which had been established in 1952, proved its value by enabling rapid identification of the new virus strain. After the pandemic, governments around the world invested in expanded surveillance capabilities and stockpiled vaccines and antivirals in preparation for future outbreaks. The H2N2 virus continued to circulate in human populations after the initial pandemic wave, causing seasonal outbreaks of varying severity throughout the 1960s. Population immunity gradually increased as more people were exposed to the virus or vaccinated against it. In 1968, the H2N2 strain was supplanted by a new variant, H3N2, which caused another pandemic, the Hong Kong flu. The H2N2 virus essentially disappeared from human circulation after 1968, though concerns remain that it could re-emerge from laboratory stocks or animal reservoirs to threaten a population that has lost all immunity to it. Dr. Maurice Hilleman, whose early warning and tireless efforts helped limit the Asian flu's toll, went on to become one of the most prolific vaccine developers in history. Over the course of his career, he created or contributed to the development of vaccines for measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, hepatitis A, hepatitis B, meningitis, and pneumonia, among others. He is credited with saving more lives than any other scientist of the 20th century. The Asian flu pandemic demonstrated both the potential of modern virology to respond to emerging threats and the limitations imposed by manufacturing capacity and distribution logistics. These lessons would inform pandemic preparedness planning for decades to come. The Asian flu pandemic claimed between 1 and 2 million lives worldwide, with most estimates centering around 1.1 million deaths. In the context of global population at the time, approximately 2.9 billion people, this represented a mortality rate of roughly 0.04%. While this percentage may seem small, the absolute numbers were staggering, and the pandemic's disruption to daily life was felt in virtually every community on Earth. The Asian flu ranks second on our list, its death toll exceeding that of the third cholera pandemic but falling well short of the catastrophes that await us higher in the ranking. Item 3. Antonine Plague. We now journey back nearly 2,000 years to examine the Antonine Plague, which devastated the Roman Empire between 165 and 180 CE, claiming an estimated 5 to 10 million lives. Named for the dynasty ruling Rome during the outbreak, the Antonines, which included the emperors Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus, this pandemic struck at the height of Roman power and may have initiated the long decline that would eventually lead to the empire's fall. The Antonine Plague was almost certainly the first recorded pandemic to affect the entire Mediterranean world, spreading along the trade routes and military supply lines that connected the far-flung provinces of the greatest empire the Western world had ever known. The Antonine Plague emerged during a period of military expansion that had brought Roman armies into contact with new populations and new diseases. In 161 CE, the Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival to the east, invaded the Roman client state of Armenia and defeated the Roman forces stationed there. The Emperor Lucius Verus was dispatched to lead a counter-offensive, and the campaign that followed would prove successful beyond Rome's expectations. Roman legions pushed deep into Parthian territory, reaching the twin capitals of Seleucia and Ctesiphon on the Tigris River in 165 CE. The cities were sacked, their treasures plundered, their populations scattered. But among the spoils of war, the Romans carried home something far more dangerous than gold. According to ancient sources, the plague first appeared among Roman troops during the siege of Seleucia. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, writing 2 centuries later, reported that soldiers had opened a sealed golden casket in a temple, releasing a pestilential vapor that spread disease across the Roman world. While this account reflects the superstitious understanding of disease transmission common in the ancient world, it preserves an important kernel of truth. The plague did originate during the Parthian campaign, and it did spread westward with the returning army. The Roman military, with its excellent roads and regular supply lines, proved an ideal vector for the disease's transmission. The symptoms of the Antonine Plague were documented by Galen, the most famous physician of the ancient world, who witnessed the outbreak firsthand. Galen described a disease that began with fever, followed by a skin eruption that could be either smooth or rough, resembling blisters. The rash typically appeared around the 9th day of illness. Patients suffered from diarrhea, which Galen noted was sometimes black in color, suggesting internal bleeding. Death, when it came, usually occurred around the 12th day. Survivors were often left with scars from the skin eruption. Based on these descriptions, modern scholars have concluded that the Antonine Plague was almost certainly smallpox, the first recorded pandemic of this disease in the Western world. Galen's account of the plague provides invaluable evidence for understanding both the disease and Roman medical practice. Born in Pergamon in modern-day Turkey around 129 CE, Galen had studied medicine in Alexandria and Smyrna before settling in Rome, where he became physician to the emperors. When the plague struck, Galen initially fled the city, a decision for which he later expressed regret. He eventually returned to Rome and treated patients throughout the outbreak, documenting his observations in meticulous detail. His description of the skin eruption and the sequence of symptoms remains the primary evidence for identifying the disease as smallpox, though some scholars have proposed measles as an alternative diagnosis. Smallpox, if indeed it was the cause of the Antonine Plague, would have been a new disease to the Roman population. The virus that causes smallpox, variola major, is believed to have evolved from an animal pox virus sometime in the first millennium BCE, possibly in the agricultural societies of the Nile Valley or South Asia. Populations that had not previously been exposed to the virus would have had no immunity whatsoever, allowing the disease to spread rapidly and kill at horrific rates. The mortality rate for smallpox in unexposed populations could reach 30% or higher. Among the densely packed urban populations of the Roman Empire, such a disease would have found ideal conditions for transmission. The plague spread with terrifying speed through the cities of the Roman Empire. Rome itself, with a population estimated at 1 million people, was particularly hard hit. The historian Cassius Dio reported that at the height of the outbreak, 2,000 people were dying daily in the capital alone. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried, and mass graves were dug outside the city walls. The wealthy fled to their country estates, leaving the poor to suffer in the crowded insulae, the multi-story apartment buildings that housed Rome's working class. Emperor Marcus Aurelius himself was not immune. While he survived the disease, his co-emperor Lucius Verus died in 169 CE, possibly as a direct result of the plague. Marcus Aurelius, left as sole emperor after the death of Verus, faced a crisis that threatened the very foundations of Roman power. The plague had devastated not only the civilian population, but also the Roman military, which had been the vector for the disease's initial spread, and which continued to suffer disproportionate losses as soldiers lived in close quarters and moved constantly across the empire. Entire legions were rendered combat ineffective. At the same time, pressure on Rome's borders was intensifying. Germanic tribes to the north, sensing Roman weakness, launched raids across the Danube frontier. Marcus Aurelius was forced to respond with depleted forces. The economic impact of the Antonine Plague was profound and long-lasting. Tax revenues declined as the population shrank and agricultural production fell. The Roman government was forced to debase its currency, reducing the silver content of coins to stretch limited resources. Prices rose, and the standard of living declined across the empire. Some scholars have argued that the Antonine Plague marked the beginning of Rome's long economic decline, setting in motion processes that would accelerate over the following centuries. The population of the empire, which had been growing steadily for centuries, began a prolonged period of stagnation or decline. The military consequences were equally severe. Unable to recruit sufficient soldiers from a diminished population, the Roman army increasingly turned to foreign mercenaries and frontier peoples to fill its ranks. These soldiers often had different loyalties and different military traditions than the citizen legionaries of earlier centuries. The quality and cohesion of the Roman military gradually declined. Frontier defenses that had once seemed impregnable began to show weaknesses. The Antonine Plague did not cause the fall of Rome. That event lay 3 centuries in the future, but it may have initiated the demographic and military decline that made that fall inevitable. The Romans responded to the plague with both practical and religious measures. Temples dedicated to Apollo and Asclepius, the gods associated with healing, saw increased devotion. New cults emerged promising protection from disease. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, despite his philosophical skepticism about traditional religion, participated publicly in religious ceremonies intended to appease the gods. Practical measures included the quarantine of affected households and the burning of infected bedding and clothing. Bodies were removed from cities as quickly as possible and buried or cremated outside the walls. These measures, while based on an incomplete understanding of disease transmission, may have helped limit the outbreak's spread. Marcus Aurelius's philosophical writings, composed during the plague years, reflect the emperor's struggle to find meaning in the face of mass death. His meditations, written in Greek as personal reflections never intended for publication, return repeatedly to themes of mortality, duty, and acceptance of fate. "Loss is nothing else but change," he wrote, "and change is nature's delight." Whether this stoic resignation provided genuine comfort during the worst years of the plague, or merely a framework for enduring unbearable loss, we cannot know. What we do know is that Marcus Aurelius continued to govern, to lead armies in the field, and to fulfill his duties as emperor until his own death in 180 CE, possibly from the plague itself, though the ancient sources are unclear on this point. The Antonine Plague eventually subsided in the early 180s, though minor outbreaks continued to occur for years afterward. The total death toll is impossible to determine with precision, but estimates range from 5 million to as high as 10 million people, perhaps a quarter of the Roman Empire's population. This demographic catastrophe reshaped Roman society in ways both immediate and long-lasting. The plague ranks third on our list, its estimated toll of 5 to 10 million deaths, making it one of the deadliest events in ancient history. The diseases that rank higher on our list claimed even more lives, but the Antonine Plague's impact on the trajectory of Western civilization gives it a significance that extends far beyond the raw numbers. Item 4. Plague of Justinian. The fourth entry on our ranking takes us to the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century CE, where the Plague of Justinian killed an estimated 15 to 25 million people between 541 and 549 CE. Named for the Emperor Justinian I, who ruled during the outbreak and survived the disease himself, this pandemic was the first recorded appearance of bubonic plague in the Mediterranean world. The bacterium responsible, Yersinia pestis, would return 8 centuries later to cause the Black Death, but its initial assault on an unprepared population was devastating beyond imagination. The Plague of Justinian struck at a moment when the Byzantine Empire seemed poised to restore Roman greatness. Instead, it set the stage for centuries of decline. Justinian I had ascended to the throne of the Eastern Roman Empire in 527 CE, inheriting a realm that still controlled the wealthy provinces of Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia. Unlike the Western Roman Empire, which had fallen to Germanic invaders in 476, the Eastern Empire, which historians call the Byzantine Empire, had survived and even flourished. Justinian was determined to reconquer the lost Western provinces and restore the Roman Empire to its former glory. His generals, particularly the brilliant Every Pandemic in History, ranked by death toll, vertical bar sleep documentary. Item 5. Third Plague Pandemic. The Third Plague Pandemic began not with a sudden explosion of death, but with a quiet stirring in the remote highlands of Yunnan Province, China. The year was 1855. In the mountainous terrain near the border of Burma, cases of a devastating illness began appearing among local populations. At first, the outbreak remained contained by geography, moving slowly through isolated villages and trading posts. For decades, the disease spread incrementally, following caravan routes and river systems, claiming lives in numbers that went largely unrecorded by the wider world. It would take nearly 40 years before this regional epidemic transformed into something far more consequential, a pandemic that would eventually reach every inhabited continent on Earth and fundamentally reshape our understanding of infectious disease. The causative agent of this pandemic was Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium responsible for the Black Death of the medieval period and the Plague of Justinian centuries before that. The Third Plague Pandemic represented the third great wave of bubonic plague to sweep across human civilization, and in some ways, it proved the most scientifically significant. Unlike its predecessors, this pandemic occurred during an era of advancing medical knowledge, laboratory techniques, and international communication. The suffering it caused would become the crucible in which modern epidemiology and bacteriology were forged. The death toll, estimated between 12 million and 15 million people over the course of the pandemic places it firmly among history's deadliest disease events. The overwhelming majority of these deaths, perhaps as many as 12 million, occurred in India alone, a staggering concentration of mortality that would reshape the subcontinent's relationship with colonial medicine and public health. The pandemic's transformation from regional crisis to global threat began in earnest in 1894, when plague arrived in Hong Kong. This bustling port city, a jewel of British colonial commerce, served as a gateway between East Asia and the rest of the world. Ships carrying tea, silk, and countless other goods departed Hong Kong for ports in India, Africa, Australia, Europe, and the Americas. When plague established itself in the crowded neighborhoods of Taiping Shan, the conditions were perfect for global dissemination. Rats carrying infected fleas found passage on steamships and sailing vessels, carrying the bacterium to distant shores with unprecedented speed. Within a decade, plague had appeared in port cities on 6 continents, from San Francisco to Sydney, from Cape Town to Glasgow. The speed of this spread reflected the interconnected nature of late 19th century commerce, a world knitted together by shipping routes and telegraph cables, yet still largely helpless against epidemic disease. It was in Hong Kong, during the outbreak of 1894, that one of the most important discoveries in medical history took place. 2 scientists, working independently and in what became a bitter rivalry, raced to identify the causative agent of plague. Alexandre Yersin, a 31-year-old French-Swiss bacteriologist trained under Louis Pasteur, arrived in Hong Kong in June of that year. Working in a small straw hut he had constructed near the mortuary, with minimal equipment and facing obstruction from British authorities who favored his Japanese competitor, Yersin performed autopsies on plague victims and isolated a previously unknown bacterium from their lymph nodes. On June 20, 1894, Yersin observed the rod-shaped bacillus under his microscope and correctly identified it as the cause of plague. The organism would eventually bear his name, Yersinia pestis. His discovery represented a turning point in humanity's war against infectious disease, transforming plague from an inexplicable curse into a comprehensible biological phenomenon that could, in theory, be studied, tracked, and ultimately controlled. The pandemic's impact on India defies easy description. Plague arrived in Bombay, now Mumbai, in August of 1896, likely carried by rats aboard ships from Hong Kong. The city's crowded neighborhoods, inadequate sanitation, and vast population of brown rats created conditions ideally suited for rapid transmission. From Bombay, plague spread inland along railway lines and trade routes, eventually reaching virtually every corner of the subcontinent. The death toll mounted with terrible consistency. In 1897 alone, over 12,000 people died in Bombay. By 1904, annual plague deaths in India had reached over 1 million. The epidemic would continue to claim lives in India well into the 20th century, with significant mortality occurring as late as the 1920s. Historical records indicate that approximately 12 million Indians perished from plague between 1898 and 1948, a death toll concentrated heavily in the Punjab, the United Provinces, and the Bombay Presidency. These numbers represent one of the deadliest sustained disease events in Indian history. The colonial response to plague in India became a source of lasting controversy and resistance. British authorities, newly armed with germ theory and epidemiological principles, implemented aggressive intervention measures that often disregarded Indian customs, religious practices, and basic dignity. The Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897 granted sweeping powers to search homes, forcibly hospitalize patients, destroy personal property, and isolate entire communities. Soldiers and sanitary workers conducted house-to-house searches, sometimes stripping residents and examining them for signs of infection. Bodies of the dead were seized for cremation or burial under government supervision, often violating Hindu and Muslim funeral traditions. These measures provoked widespread resentment and resistance. On June 22, 1897, two brothers named Damodar and Balkrishna Chapakar assassinated Walter Charles Rand, the British official overseeing plague operations in Pune, along with his military escort. The Chapakar brothers were later captured and hanged, becoming nationalist martyrs whose actions reflected the deep tensions between colonial public health imperatives and Indian self-determination. Beyond Asia, the third plague pandemic established itself in ports around the world, including several outbreaks in the United States. Plague arrived in San Francisco in March 1900, most likely carried by rats aboard a ship from Hong Kong. The first confirmed victim was a Chinese immigrant named Wong Chut King, whose body was found in a hotel basement in Chinatown. City and state officials, fearing economic damage from quarantine measures, initially denied the outbreak and suppressed evidence of infection. The response also reflected the virulent anti-Chinese racism of the era. Authorities imposed quarantine measures specifically on Chinatown, preventing Chinese residents from leaving while allowing white residents and visitors to pass freely. Federal courts eventually struck down these discriminatory measures as unconstitutional, but the episode revealed how racism and economic interests could distort public health responses. Plague would continue to appear sporadically in the United States, eventually establishing itself among wild rodent populations in the American West, where it remains endemic to this day. The pandemic also reached Australia, where the first cases appeared in Sydney in January 1900. The outbreak killed 103 people in Sydney alone, prompting an aggressive public health response that included the destruction of rat-infested waterfront buildings and the implementation of improved sanitation measures. The Sydney outbreak contributed to significant urban reforms and helped establish Australia's quarantine infrastructure. Similar stories played out in ports from South Africa to South America. In Cape Town, plague arrived in February 1901, killing over 700 people and prompting the forced removal of black African residents from the city centre to newly established segregated townships. This public health measure laid the groundwork for the apartheid-era policies that would formalize racial segregation decades later. In Buenos Aires, plague appeared in 1899, while outbreaks occurred in Paraguay, Ecuador, and Peru throughout the early 20th century. Each local epidemic added to the pandemic's global toll, while also shaping local political, social, and medical institutions. The third plague pandemic's lasting legacy extends far beyond its death toll. The scientific investigations it prompted transformed our understanding of how diseases spread. In 1898, Paul-Louis Simond, a French physician working in Karachi, demonstrated that fleas served as the vector for plague transmission, explaining the long-observed connection between rat die-offs and human epidemics. This discovery, initially met with skepticism, eventually revolutionized plague control by shifting focus from patient isolation to rodent and flea elimination. The pandemic also prompted the creation of new international health institutions and agreements, recognizing that disease in one country threatened all nations. The lessons learned during the third plague pandemic directly informed the development of modern epidemiology and disease surveillance systems. With its estimated 12 to 15 million deaths, primarily concentrated in India but felt across the globe, the third plague pandemic ranks among history's deadliest disease events. Its mortality, while devastating, ultimately falls short of the pandemics that occupy the higher positions on our list. Item 6. HIV/AIDS pandemic. The human immunodeficiency virus, known universally as HIV, represents one of the most significant epidemiological events in modern human history. Unlike the pandemics that preceded it on our list, HIV/AIDS emerged within living memory, its story still unfolding in hospitals, laboratories, and communities around the world. The virus attacks the human immune system with devastating precision, specifically targeting CD4 cells, the helper T lymphocytes that coordinate the body's defense against infection. As these cells are progressively destroyed over months and years, the infected person becomes increasingly vulnerable to opportunistic infections and cancers that a healthy immune system would easily control. This final stage of infection is known as acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, or AIDS. Since the pandemic's recognition in 1981, HIV has infected an estimated 85 million people worldwide. Of these, approximately 40 million have died, making HIV/AIDS one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history. Today, nearly 39 million people live with the virus, and the pandemic continues to claim approximately 630,000 lives annually. The first official recognition of what would become the AIDS pandemic came on June 5, 1981, when the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention published a brief report in its Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. The article, written by Dr. Michael Gottlieb and colleagues, described 5 cases of pneumocystis carinii pneumonia in previously healthy young gay men in Los Angeles. This particular pneumonia was extraordinarily rare, typically seen only in severely immunocompromised patients, such as organ transplant recipients or those undergoing cancer chemotherapy. The fact that 5 otherwise healthy young men had developed this infection within a short period suggested something deeply unusual was occurring. The report noted that all 5 patients showed evidence of other opportunistic infections and severely depleted immune function. 2 had already died by the time of publication. This brief clinical document marked the beginning of humanity's awareness of HIV/AIDS, though the virus itself had been silently spreading for decades before that June morning. The origins of HIV trace back far earlier than 1981, deep into the forests of Central Africa. Scientists now understand that HIV evolved from a simian immunodeficiency virus, SIV, that infected chimpanzees in what is now southeastern Cameroon. At some point in the early 20th century, likely between 1900 and 1930, the virus crossed the species barrier into humans, probably through hunters who came into contact with infected chimpanzee blood while butchering bushmeat. Genetic analysis suggests that the most recent common ancestor of the main HIV pandemic strain, known as HIV-1 group M, existed around 1920. The virus initially spread slowly through small communities in the colonial Belgian Congo, eventually reaching the growing city of Leopoldville, now Kinshasa, in what is today the Democratic Republic of the Congo. From there, it spread along railways and rivers, reaching other African population centers. By the 1960s, the virus had established itself in Haiti, carried there by Haitian professionals returning from work in the newly independent Congo. From Haiti, HIV reached the United States around 1970, where it initially spread silently through sexual networks before exploding into visibility a decade later. The years immediately following the 1981 recognition of AIDS were marked by fear, confusion, and a desperate search for answers. The disease initially appeared almost exclusively among gay men, leading to the deeply stigmatizing early name gay-related immune deficiency, or GRID. Cases soon appeared among intravenous drug users, hemophiliacs receiving blood transfusions, and eventually among heterosexual individuals with no identified risk factors. The pattern of transmission suggested an infectious agent spread through blood and sexual contact, but the actual pathogen remained elusive. In 1983, a team at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, led by Luc Montagnier and Françoise Barre-Sinoussi, isolated a retrovirus from the lymph node of an AIDS patient. They named it lymphadenopathy-associated virus, or LAVE. The following year, Robert Gallo's team at the National Cancer Institute in the United States announced they had isolated the cause of AIDS, which they called human T lymphotropic virus type 3, or HTLV3. A bitter priority dispute followed, eventually resolved by an international committee that established the name human immunodeficiency virus in 1986. Montagnier and Barre-Sinoussi would receive the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2008 for their discovery. The early AIDS epidemic in the United States devastated entire communities with a speed and thoroughness that remains difficult to comprehend. San Francisco's Castro District and New York's Greenwich Village, neighborhoods that had become centers of gay liberation and culture in the 1970s, were hit with particular severity. Between 1981 and 1990, AIDS killed more than 100,000 Americans. In San Francisco alone, over 15,000 men died during the first decade of the epidemic, representing a substantial percentage of the city's gay male population. The writer and activist Cleve Jones, who founded the AIDS Memorial Quilt, later recalled walking through the Castro in 1985 and realizing that nearly every storefront displayed a memorial photograph of someone who had died. The social infrastructure of gay communities, the bars, bathhouses, community centers, and activist organizations that had been painstakingly built over decades was hollowed out by illness and death. An entire generation of artists, writers, activists, and ordinary citizens was lost. The political response to AIDS in the United States during the 1980s was characterized by neglect, stigma, and active hostility from the highest levels of government. President Ronald Reagan did not publicly mention AIDS until 1985, 4 years after the epidemic's recognition, and after more than 12,000 Americans had already died. Federal funding for AIDS research and treatment remained grossly inadequate relative to the scale of the crisis. Much of the public and political establishment viewed AIDS as a moral failing rather than a medical emergency, a disease that afflicted populations already marginalized by society: gay men, intravenous drug users, sex workers, and poor communities of color. This institutional neglect galvanized one of the most significant activist movements in American medical history. Groups like the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, known as ACE-T-UP, used direct action, civil disobedience, and sophisticated media campaigns to demand accelerated drug approval processes, expanded access to experimental treatments, and increased research funding. Their slogan, "Silence equals death," became an emblem of the era. The development of effective treatments for HIV represents one of modern medicine's greatest achievements. The first antiretroviral drug, azithromycin or AZT, received FDA approval in March 1987, just 20 months after clinical trials began, a record for drug development at that time. AZT demonstrated the ability to slow viral replication and extend survival, but it was far from a cure. The drug caused severe side effects, including anemia and muscle weakness, and the virus quickly developed resistance when AZT was used alone. For nearly a decade, people with HIV faced limited treatment options and a near-certain progression to AIDS and death. The breakthrough came in 1995 and 1996 with the development of protease inhibitors and the introduction of highly active antiretroviral therapy known as HAART. By combining multiple drugs that attacked the virus at different points in its life cycle, Heart could suppress HIV to undetectable levels, allowing immune systems to recover and transforming HIV from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition. At the International AIDS Conference in Vancouver in July 1996, researchers presented data showing dramatic reductions in AIDS deaths among patients receiving combination therapy. The announcement marked a turning point in the pandemic. The global dimension of the HIV/AIDS pandemic extends far beyond the wealthy nations where it first gained visibility. Sub-Saharan Africa has borne the overwhelming burden of HIV infection and AIDS mortality. The virus spread rapidly through the region during the 1980s and 1990s, fueled by poverty, inadequate healthcare infrastructure, gender inequality, and social disruption. By 2000, life expectancy in some southern African countries had dropped by more than 15 years due to AIDS. In Botswana, over 25% of adults were HIV positive. In South Africa, more than 5 million people lived with the virus. Entire nations faced the loss of teachers, healthcare workers, farmers, and parents, leaving behind millions of orphaned children. The human cost was incalculable. For years, effective antiretroviral treatments remained unavailable to the vast majority of infected people in developing countries due to their prohibitive cost. A year's supply of heart medications could cost $10,000 or more, utterly beyond the reach of people living on less than $1 a day. The struggle to provide affordable HIV treatment to the developing world became one of the defining global health battles of the early 21st century. Activist groups, non-governmental organizations, and developing country governments challenged the pharmaceutical patent system that kept drug prices high. Indian generic drug manufacturers began producing antiretroviral medications at a fraction of the cost charged by Western pharmaceutical companies, reducing the annual cost of treatment from over $10,000 to less than $150 per patient. International funding mechanisms, most notably the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria, established in 2002, and the United States President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, known as PEPFAR, launched in 2003, dramatically expanded access to treatment in the hardest-hit regions. PEPFAR alone has provided antiretroviral treatment to over 20 million people and is credited with saving approximately 25 million lives. These programs represent the largest investment in combating a single disease in human history. Today, the HIV/AIDS pandemic continues, though its character has fundamentally changed. Modern antiretroviral therapy allows people with HIV to live normal lifespans if they have access to treatment and maintain adherence to their medications. The concept of undetectable equals untransmittable, or U equals sign U, has been scientifically validated. People with HIV who maintain an undetectable viral load through treatment cannot transmit the virus to sexual partners. Pre-exposure prophylaxis, known as PrEP, allows HIV-negative individuals at high risk to take daily medication that provides near-complete protection against infection. New long-acting injectable medications offer alternatives to daily pills. Clinical trials continue to pursue a functional cure or vaccine, with several promising candidates under investigation. Yet despite these advances, significant challenges remain. Stigma continues to prevent many people from seeking testing and treatment. Access to healthcare remains deeply unequal across and within countries. In 2022, approximately 1.3 million people were newly infected with HIV, and 630,000 died of AIDS-related causes. The virus continues to spread, particularly among young people in sub-Saharan Africa and among marginalized populations worldwide. The HIV/AIDS pandemic has claimed approximately 40 million lives since its emergence, with millions more projected in the years ahead as the pandemic continues. This death toll secures its position as one of history's deadliest disease events. Beyond the raw numbers, HIV/AIDS transformed medicine, reshaped social movements, challenged global economic structures, and forced uncomfortable conversations about sexuality, drug use, inequality, and the value placed on different human lives. The AIDS Memorial Quilt, conceived by Cleve Jones in 1985, grew to include over 50,000 panels, each commemorating a life lost to the epidemic. When displayed on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., in October 1996, the quilt stretched for more than a mile. It remains the largest community art project in the world. The pandemic taught hard lessons about the cost of stigma, the importance of community activism, and the possibility of transforming a fatal diagnosis into a chronic, manageable condition. These lessons continue to inform global health responses to emerging infectious diseases. Item 7. 1918 Spanish Flu. In the spring of 1918, as the Great War ground through its fourth devastating year, a new threat emerged that would ultimately claim more lives than all the artillery shells, machine guns, and poison gas of that terrible conflict. The 1918 influenza pandemic, commonly known as the Spanish flu, remains the deadliest disease outbreak in modern history, killing an estimated 50 million people worldwide in just over 2 years. Some scholarly estimates place the death toll as high as 100 million, though the true number will never be known with certainty due to incomplete record keeping, particularly in colonial territories and developing regions. The pandemic infected approximately 500 million people, roughly 1/3 of the world's population at the time. It circled the globe in 3 distinct waves, appearing first in the spring of 1918, returning with devastating force in the autumn of that year, and striking again in the winter and spring of 1919. The virus showed a peculiar and deadly predilection for young adults, inverting the typical pattern of influenza mortality and creating a generation marked by early death and lasting grief. The precise origins of the 1918 pandemic remain a subject of scientific debate, though the virus almost certainly did not originate in Spain, despite its common name. Spain, as a neutral nation during World War I, did not impose wartime censorship on its press. When influenza swept through the country in May 1918, Spanish newspapers reported openly on the outbreak, including the illness of King Alfonso XIII. Meanwhile, combatant nations suppressed news of the disease to maintain civilian and military morale. The result was that Spain appeared to be the epicenter of a pandemic that was actually already spreading across the globe, and the name Spanish flu entered the historical record. Modern research suggests the pandemic may have originated in the United States, possibly in Haskell County, Kansas, a rural area where a local physician named Loring Minor observed an unusually severe influenza outbreak in January and February 1918. Minor was sufficiently alarmed to report the cases to the United States Public Health Service, a rare act that left one of the few written records of the pandemic's potential birthplace. The transmission of the virus from rural Kansas to the world was facilitated by the massive mobilization of World War I. In March 1918, influenza appeared at Camp Funston, a military training facility at Fort Riley, Kansas, where thousands of young recruits were being prepared for deployment to Europe. On the morning of March 4, 1918, a company cook named Albert Gitchell reported to the camp infirmary with fever, sore throat, and headache. By noon, over 100 soldiers had presented with similar symptoms. Within a week, 500 men at Camp Funston were sick. The virus spread rapidly through the crowded barracks and mess halls, then traveled with soldiers as they transferred to other camps across the United States and boarded troop ships bound for France. The packed conditions aboard transport vessels created perfect incubators for viral transmission. On the USS Leviathan, one of the largest troop ships in service, influenza swept through the 14,000 soldiers and crew members during an Atlantic crossing in late September 1918. By the time the ship reached France, over 2,000 men were sick and nearly 100 had died, their bodies buried at sea. The first wave of the pandemic, occurring in the spring and summer of 1918, was relatively mild compared to what followed. Mortality rates were elevated, but not dramatically so, and most patients recovered within a few days. Military officials and public health authorities noted the unusual prevalence of influenza, but did not recognize it as the beginning of a catastrophic pandemic. The virus continued to circulate through the summer, spreading across Europe, Asia, and Africa through military movements, shipping routes, and normal human contact. Then, in August 1918, something changed. The virus that emerged in the autumn was far more virulent than its spring predecessor, striking with terrifying speed and unusual lethality. Patients who felt fine in the morning could be dead by nightfall. The second wave appeared almost simultaneously in 3 distant locations: Brest, France, Freetown, Sierra Leone, and Boston, Massachusetts. From these points, it radiated outward with devastating effect, following the interconnected pathways of war, commerce, and colonialism. The clinical presentation of severe 1918 influenza was unlike anything physicians had seen before. Dr. Roy Grist, a physician at the United States Naval Hospital in Chelsea, Massachusetts, described patients turning a dusky leaden hue as their lungs filled with fluid. "It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes," he wrote. "It is horrible." Many victims developed what medical personnel called heliotrope cyanosis, a distinctive mahogany or blue discoloration of the face caused by oxygen deprivation as damaged lungs failed to function. Autopsies revealed lungs so heavy with fluid that they resembled liver tissue. Some patients bled from the nose, mouth, and even ears. The speed of decline was shocking. A common saying of the time held that a person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by supper. This rapidity of death, combined with the sheer number of cases, overwhelmed medical facilities and funeral services. In Philadelphia, one of the hardest-hit American cities, bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried, and mass graves were dug to accommodate the dead. The response to the pandemic varied dramatically across jurisdictions, with consequences that would inform public health policy for a century. Philadelphia provides a tragic case study in delayed action. Despite warnings from physicians that a massive influenza outbreak was underway, city officials refused to cancel a scheduled Liberty Loan parade on September 28, 1918. An estimated 200,000 people crowded together along Broad Street to watch the patriotic procession. Within 72 hours, every bed in Philadelphia's 31 hospitals was filled. Within 6 weeks, more than 12,000 Philadelphians had died. By contrast, St. Louis implemented aggressive social distancing measures immediately upon recognizing the outbreak, closing schools, theaters, churches, and other gathering places. The city banned public gatherings and staggered business hours to reduce crowding on streetcars. St. Louis experienced a death rate less than half that of Philadelphia, a difference that demonstrated the life-saving potential of what we now call non-pharmaceutical interventions. The comparative mortality data from American cities during the 1918 pandemic would later inform public health responses to COVID-19 more than a century later. Across the United States, communities struggled to maintain basic functions as the second wave crashed over them. Schools closed, factories shut down, businesses folded. In some towns, so many people were sick simultaneously that there was no one left to tend the ill, prepare food, or bury the dead. The American Red Cross issued urgent appeals for volunteer nurses, but volunteers often fell ill themselves within days of beginning their service. Coffin shortages became acute in many cities. In Philadelphia, bodies were stored in cold storage facilities, schools, and private homes, while families waited for burial. Some communities were forced to dig mass graves using steam shovels. The social fabric frayed under the strain. In some neighborhoods, the sick were abandoned by terrified neighbors. In others, remarkable acts of mutual aid and community solidarity emerged. Women's organizations, church groups, and civic associations mobilized to deliver food, check on the isolated, and provide what comfort they could in the absence of effective medical treatment. The pandemic struck with particular ferocity among indigenous populations and isolated communities with no prior exposure to influenza. In Alaska, entire villages were wiped out. The town of Brevig Mission lost 72 of its 80 adult residents within 5 days. Survivors, many of them children, were left to bury their own parents in the frozen ground. In Western Samoa, then administered by New Zealand, the SS Talon arrived from Auckland on November 7, 1918, carrying passengers infected with influenza. New Zealand authorities failed to implement quarantine measures. Within 2 months, approximately 22% of Western Samoa's population had died, one of the highest mortality rates recorded anywhere during the pandemic. By contrast, American Samoa, just 40 miles away, imposed strict quarantine on all arriving vessels and recorded 0 influenza deaths. The divergent outcomes in these neighboring islands provided stark evidence of the life-saving power of public health intervention. One of the most puzzling features of the 1918 pandemic was its unusual age distribution of mortality. Typical influenza outbreaks kill primarily the very young and the elderly, producing a U-shaped mortality curve. The 1918 pandemic instead showed a distinctive W-shaped pattern, with an additional peak of mortality among adults aged 20 to 40, precisely the population normally most resistant to infectious disease. Young adults died at rates far exceeding those of older individuals, leaving behind orphaned children and devastated families. This pattern has been attributed to an overreaction of the immune system called a cytokine storm, in which the body's defensive response becomes so powerful that it damages the patient's own tissues. Ironically, the strongest immune systems may have produced the most violent and fatal inflammatory responses. Another theory suggests that older adults possessed partial immunity from exposure to a related influenza strain that circulated in every pandemic in history, ranked by death toll. Vertical bar sleep documentary. Item 8. COVID-19. Pandemic. In the final days of December 2019, physicians at hospitals in Wuhan, China, began noticing clusters of patients presenting with an unusual pneumonia. The cases shared common features: fever, dry cough, and bilateral ground glass opacities visible on chest imaging. Many of the early patients had connections to the Huanan seafood wholesale market, a sprawling wet market in the city's Jianghan district, where live animals were sold alongside fish and produce. On December 31st, 2019, China's health authorities notified the World Health Organization of these cases. Within days, researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology had isolated a novel coronavirus from patient samples. By January 7th, 2020, they had sequenced its genome and shared it with the world. The virus was eventually designated SARS-CoV-2, and the disease it caused would be named COVID-19. No one could yet imagine how profoundly this pathogen would reshape daily life across every continent on Earth. The coronavirus belonged to a family of viruses already known to science. Previous coronaviruses had caused the SARS outbreak of 2003 and the MERS outbreak that began in 2012. But this new variant, possessed characteristics that made it particularly suited for rapid transmission between humans. Its spike proteins bound efficiently to ACE2 receptors in human cells, and infected individuals could spread the virus before experiencing any symptoms at all. This pre-symptomatic transmission would prove decisive in the virus's global spread. On January 13, 2020, Thailand reported the first confirmed case outside China. Japan followed on January 16th. By January 20th, the first case had been identified in the United States. A 35-year-old man in Snohomish County, Washington, who had recently returned from visiting family in Wuhan. The patient timeline had begun, and it would soon accelerate beyond any reasonable projection. On January 30th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared a public health emergency of international concern. At that point, the official case count stood at 7,818 confirmed infections across 19 countries, with 170 deaths recorded. Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, the WHO Director General, stated during the announcement, "The main reason for this declaration is not what is happening in China, but what is happening in other countries. Our greatest concern is the potential for the virus to spread to countries with weaker health systems." Those words would prove prescient. By February, the virus had established footholds in Iran, Italy, and South Korea. Lombardy in northern Italy saw its hospitals overwhelmed within weeks. Images emerged of intensive care units filled beyond capacity, medical staff working in garbage bags for want of proper protective equipment, and military trucks transporting coffins from Bergamo because the local crematorium could no longer handle the volume of the dead. The pandemic's arrival in Italy marked a turning point in global awareness. On March 9, 2020, Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte announced a nationwide lockdown, the first of its kind in a Western democracy since the Second World War. Within days, similar measures spread across Europe. Spain, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom each implemented their own restrictions on movement and commerce. On March 11, 2020, the WHO officially declared COVID-19 a pandemic. By that date, more than 118,000 cases had been confirmed across 114 countries, with 4,291 deaths. The virus had reached every continent except Antarctica. Stock markets collapsed, borders closed, schools emptied. The ordinary rhythms of human society ground to a halt in ways that seemed, to many, simply unprecedented. The economic and social disruption extended far beyond the immediate health crisis. In the United States, unemployment claims surged from 282,000 in the week ending March 14th to 3.3 million the following week, the largest increase in American history. By early April, that number had risen to 6.6 million claims in a single week. Entire industries collapsed overnight. Airlines grounded fleets, restaurants closed, theaters went dark. The hospitality sector shed jobs at a rate that defied historical comparison. Meanwhile, essential workers, from grocery store employees to warehouse staff to healthcare providers, continued their labor under conditions of unprecedented risk. The pandemic revealed and amplified existing inequalities. Communities of color experienced disproportionate death rates. Lower-income workers faced impossible choices between personal safety and economic survival. New York City became the pandemic's first major American epicenter. By April 2020, the city was recording more than 500 deaths per day. Hospital ships arrived in New York Harbor. The Jacob K. Javits Convention Center was converted into a temporary medical facility. Refrigerated trucks lined the streets outside overwhelmed hospitals, serving as makeshift morgues. Governor Andrew Cuomo held daily briefings that drew national attention. presenting data on hospitalizations, intubations, and deaths with the grim regularity of wartime dispatches. The city that had defined itself by density and energy fell silent. Subway cars ran empty. Streets stood deserted. At 7 o'clock each evening, New Yorkers leaned out of their windows to cheer and applaud healthcare workers, a ritual of solidarity that echoed through empty canyons of concrete and glass. The scientific response to COVID-19 proceeded at a pace without precedent in the history of medicine. Within days of receiving the viral genome, researchers at Moderna in Cambridge, Massachusetts, had designed a messenger RNA vaccine candidate. Clinical trials began in March 2020. By December, both the Moderna vaccine and a similar product developed by Pfizer, in partnership with German firm BioNTech, had received emergency use authorization from the United States Food and Drug Administration. The Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine demonstrated 95% efficacy against symptomatic COVID-19 infection in clinical trials involving 43,000 participants. On December 14, 2020, Sandra Lindsay, a critical care nurse at Long Island Jewish Medical Center in Queens, received the first authorized COVID-19 vaccine dose administered in the United States. She told reporters afterward, "I feel hopeful today, relieved. I feel like healing is coming." The vaccine rollout proceeded unevenly across nations and within them. Wealthy countries secured advance purchase agreements that guaranteed early access to supplies. By February 2021, Israel had administered at least one vaccine dose to more than 50% of its population. Meanwhile, many African nations had not yet received any doses at all. The COVAX initiative, designed to ensure equitable global vaccine distribution, struggled to meet its targets. Domestically, the United States grappled with its own distribution challenges. Scheduling systems crashed. Eligibility requirements shifted. Vaccine hesitancy, fueled by misinformation spreading through social media channels, meant that supply eventually exceeded demand in many communities, even as others continued to wait. The death toll climbed steadily through successive waves, driven by new variants. The Alpha variant, first identified in the United Kingdom in late 2020, spread more readily than the original strain. The Delta variant, detected in India in early 2021, proved even more transmissible and more likely to cause severe disease in unvaccinated individuals. India's second wave in April and May 2021 overwhelmed the country's healthcare infrastructure. Crematoria ran out of wood. Families searched desperately for oxygen cylinders. Official death counts, widely believed to be undercounted, still reached staggering figures. The Omicron variant emerged in South Africa in November 2021, spreading with unprecedented speed, but causing somewhat less severe illness on average, particularly among vaccinated populations. By March 2023, the World Health Organization had recorded more than 6.8 million confirmed COVID-19 deaths globally. The actual toll was certainly higher. Excess mortality analyses suggested true figures ranging from 15 million to more than 20 million deaths attributable to the pandemic through its first 3 years. In the United States alone, more than 1.1 million people died from COVID-19. The pandemic's effects extended far beyond direct mortality. Long COVID, a constellation of symptoms persisting weeks or months after initial infection, affected millions of survivors. Mental health deteriorated across populations. Educational disruptions set back children's learning. The full accounting of the pandemic's consequences will occupy researchers for decades. COVID-19 ranks 8th on our list, with a death toll that conservative estimates place above 7 million confirmed deaths, and more comprehensive analyses suggesting figures between 15 and 20 million excess deaths worldwide. This places it among the deadliest events in human history, though below several earlier pandemics that struck populations with fewer medical resources and no understanding of germ theory. What distinguishes COVID-19 is the extraordinary documentation of its spread, the global coordination of scientific response, and the way it demonstrated both the power and the limits of modern public health infrastructure. It arrived in an age of instant communication and unprecedented medical capability, yet still it killed millions. It remains for many alive today the defining collective experience of a generation. Item 9. Black Death. In the autumn of 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina after a long journey through the Black Sea. The harbor officials who greeted the vessels encountered a scene of profound horror. Most of the sailors aboard the ships were dead. Those still alive were gravely ill, their bodies covered with black boils that oozed blood and pus. The authorities ordered the ships to leave the harbor immediately, but it was already too late. The disease had made landfall in Europe. Within 5 years, it would kill between 75 and 200 million people, erasing somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population. This was the Black Death, the most devastating pandemic in recorded human history, measured by the proportion of the population it destroyed. Its arrival would permanently alter the trajectory of Western civilization. The disease that arrived in Messina was bubonic plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The pathogen lives in the digestive systems of fleas that typically infest rats and other rodents. When an infected flea bites a human, it regurgitates bacteria into the wound. The bacteria migrate to the nearest lymph node, where they multiply rapidly, causing the characteristic swellings called buboes that give bubonic plague its name. These swellings, which could grow to the size of eggs or apples, appeared most commonly in the groin, armpits, and neck. In the majority of untreated cases, death followed within a week, but plague also manifested in 2 other even more lethal forms. Septicemic plague occurred when bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, causing death so rapidly that victims sometimes died before any buboes could form. Pneumonic plague developed when the infection spread to the lungs, at which point patients could transmit the disease directly through respiratory droplets, without any flea intermediary at all. The Black Death did not originate in Europe. Modern genetic analysis has traced its source to Central Asia, likely the area around Lake Issyk-Kul in present-day Kyrgyzstan. Archaeological excavations at medieval cemeteries near the lake have uncovered tombstones from 1338 and 1339 that specifically mention pestilence as the cause of death. DNA extracted from teeth in these graves confirms the presence of Yersinia pestis strains ancestral to those that would later devastate Europe. From this origin point, the plague traveled westward along the Silk Road, the network of trade routes connecting Asia to the Mediterranean world. By 1346, it had reached the Crimean Peninsula, where Genoese merchants maintained trading posts along the Black Sea coast. It was from the Crimean port of Kaffa that the infected ships would sail to Messina. The siege of Kaffa in 1346 has become one of the most discussed events in the history of biological warfare. The Mongol army of Yani Beg had surrounded the Genoese settlement when plague broke out among their forces. According to the account of Gabriele de Mussi, a notary from Piacenza, the Mongols catapulted the corpses of plague victims over the city walls in an attempt to spread the disease among the defenders. Whether this tactic actually transmitted the plague remains debated among historians and epidemiologists. The bacteria typically survive only briefly in dead hosts, and rats and fleas likely crossed between the besieging army and the city, regardless of any deliberate action. What is certain is that plague entered Kaffa during the siege, and that refugees fleeing the city by ship carried it to Constantinople, then to Sicily, and onward across the Mediterranean. From Sicily, the plague spread with terrifying speed. It reached the Italian mainland by early 1348, striking Genoa, Venice and Pisa within weeks of each other. Florence was devastated. The city's population fell from approximately 100,000 before the plague to fewer than 50,000 afterward. Giovanni Boccaccio, who witnessed the plague in Florence, described the catastrophe in the introduction to his Decameron. How many brave men, how many fair ladies, how many gallant youths, whom Galen, Hippocrates, or Aesculapius themselves would have judged most healthy, breakfasted with their families in the morning, and that same evening supped with their ancestors in the next world. Boccaccio's account emphasized the complete breakdown of social order. The sick were abandoned, the dead were left unburied, families dissolved. The normal bonds of human society simply ceased to function under the weight of such overwhelming mortality. The plague crossed the Alps into northern Europe during the summer and autumn of 1348. It reached Paris in June, killing an estimated 50,000 people within 18 months. By August, it had arrived in England, landing at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. The chronicler Henry Knighton recorded that there died at Leicester alone more than 380, in the small parish of St Leonard's more than 400, and in the parish of Holy Cross more than 700. By the end of 1349, the plague had swept through the British Isles, Scandinavia, and the Germanic lands. It penetrated into Poland and Russia, completing its circuit of the European continent. No region was spared. No social class enjoyed immunity. Pope Clement VI, sheltered in his palace at Avignon, survived by staying between two large fires that his physicians believed would purify the air. Many of his cardinals and servants were not so fortunate. The medical understanding of the era provided little guidance for those seeking to avoid or treat the disease. The prevailing theory attributed illness to miasma, poisonous vapors arising from rotting organic matter or cosmic disturbances. Physicians recommended burning aromatic woods, carrying bouquets of flowers, or avoiding bathing, which was believed to open the pores and allow harmful air to enter the body. The medical faculty of the University of Paris, convened by King Philip VI to investigate the plague's causes, concluded that a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter and Mars in March 1345 had corrupted the atmosphere and caused the epidemic. Their report, issued in October 1348, advised carrying amber and incense, avoiding bathing, abstaining from certain foods, and reducing physical exertion. These recommendations were useless against fleas and bacteria, but they represented the best knowledge available to medieval medicine. In the absence of effective medical intervention, communities sought other explanations and remedies for the disaster. Some turned to religious penance. Flagellant processions appeared across Europe, groups of men and women who traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves to atone for the sins they believed had brought divine punishment upon humanity. Pope Clement VI initially tolerated the flagellants, but eventually condemned the movement in 1349, concerned about its challenge to ecclesiastical authority and its association with violence against Jews. Anti-Jewish persecution intensified dramatically during the Black Death. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned wells to cause the plague. In Strasbourg, on February 14, 1349, approximately 2,000 Jews were burned alive on a wooden platform in the city's Jewish cemetery. Similar massacres occurred in Basel, Cologne, and dozens of other cities. Pope Clement issued papal bulls defending the Jews and pointing out that they died of plague at the same rate as Christians. But his intervention did little to stop the violence. The demographic impact of the Black Death was without parallel in European history. England's population fell from approximately 4.8 million in 1348 to around 2.6 million by 1351. Similar proportional losses occurred across the continent. Entire villages were abandoned. Fields went untilled. The shortage of labor transformed the economic and social structure of medieval Europe. Peasants who survived could demand higher wages and better conditions, knowing that their labor was now scarce and valuable. In England, the Statute of Labourers of 1351 attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but enforcement proved impossible. The erosion of feudal obligations accelerated. Serfdom declined. The rigid social hierarchies that had characterized medieval society began to loosen under the pressure of demographic catastrophe. The plague did not end in 1351. It returned in waves throughout the following centuries, though never again with the same devastating mortality as the initial outbreak. The second pandemic continued in Europe until the early 18th century, with notable recurrences including the pestilence of 1361, known as the Children's Plague for its disproportionate impact on the young, and the Great Plague of London in 1665, which killed an estimated 100,000 people in the English capital. The cultural and psychological impact of the Black Death persisted long after the immediate crisis passed. Death became a central theme in European art. The Danse Macabre, depicting skeletons leading people of all social ranks in a dance toward the grave, appeared in churches and cemeteries across the continent. The memento mori tradition flourished, reminding the living of their own mortality through images of skulls, hourglasses, and decaying flesh. The Black Death ranks 9th on our list, with a death toll estimated between 75 and 200 million people, representing the destruction of somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population, and significant mortality across Asia and North Africa as well. The range in these estimates reflects the fragmentary nature of medieval records and the difficulty of reconstructing population figures from centuries ago. What places the Black Death so high despite this uncertainty is the consistency of the evidence for catastrophic mortality. Contemporary chroniclers, archaeological records, and parish registers all point to the same conclusion. This was a disaster of almost unimaginable scale. It remains the deadliest pandemic in history when measured by the proportion of the affected population that it killed, a distinction it holds even against events with higher absolute death tolls that struck larger baseline populations. Item 10. Columbian Exchange Epidemics. On October 12, 1492, Christopher Columbus and his crew made landfall in the Bahamas, initiating contact between two branches of humanity that had been separated for approximately 15,000 years. The Taino people who inhabited the island they called Guanahani had never encountered Europeans. Columbus, believing he had reached the Indies, called them Indians. He described them in his journal as a people very poor in everything, but noted that they were very well made, with very handsome bodies and very good faces. Within decades, the Taino would be virtually extinct, devastated by a combination of violence, enslavement, and above all, disease. What followed Columbus's voyage was the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history: the decimation of the indigenous populations of the Americas by diseases introduced from Europe and Africa. Conservative estimates place the death toll at 56 million people. Some scholars argue the actual figure exceeded 90 million. Either number would represent the single deadliest series of epidemics ever recorded. The Americas in 1492 were home to complex civilizations that had developed independently from those of the Eastern Hemisphere. The Aztec Empire controlled a territory spanning central Mexico, with its capital, Tenochtitlan, supporting a population larger than any city in Europe. The Inca Empire stretched along the spine of the Andes, administering millions of subjects through an elaborate system of roads, warehouses, and record-keeping. In North America, the Mississippian culture had constructed earthen mounds and supported densely populated settlements along the continent's major rivers. Estimates of the total population of the Americas before 1492 vary widely, but recent scholarship suggests figures between 50 and 100 million people, with some analyses proposing populations as high as 112 million. These were not empty continents awaiting European settlement. They were homelands to countless distinct peoples with their own languages, religions, political systems, and ways of life. The epidemiological history of the Americas differed fundamentally from that of Eurasia and Africa. The Eastern Hemisphere had experienced thousands of years of devastating epidemics as densely populated agricultural societies came into contact with domesticated animals and with each other. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, plague, and a host of other infectious diseases had repeatedly swept through these populations, killing millions in each outbreak, but also leaving surviving populations with some degree of immunological resistance. The Americas, by contrast, had relatively few domesticated animals, no cattle, pigs, sheep, or horses, and their populations had never been exposed to most of the diseases that circulated in the Old World. Indigenous Americans had no antibodies to smallpox because they had never encountered smallpox. They had no resistance to measles because measles had never reached their shores. When Europeans arrived carrying these pathogens, the results were catastrophic. Smallpox was almost certainly the first and most devastating of the introduced diseases. The variola virus likely reached the Caribbean by 1518, carried by Spanish colonists or African slaves. It spread to the Mexican mainland in 1520, during Hernán Cortés's campaign against the Aztec Empire. One of Cortés's men, a slave named Francisco de Aguirre, was among those infected. The disease spread rapidly through the Aztec population, which had no prior exposure and therefore no immunity whatsoever. Among those killed was Cuitlahuac, the emperor who had succeeded Moctezuma II and was organizing resistance against the Spanish invaders. The epidemic killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the Aztec population within a year. Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan friar who later compiled accounts of the conquest from indigenous informants, recorded their description of the pestilence. There was great havoc. Very many died of it. They could not walk. They only lay in their resting places and beds. They could not move. They could not stir. They could not change position, nor lie on one side, nor face down, nor on their backs. The pattern established in Mexico repeated itself throughout the Americas. Smallpox reached the Inca Empire before the Spanish did, carried south along indigenous trade routes. The disease killed the Inca Emperor Huayna Capac and his designated heir around 1527, precipitating a civil war between rival claimants that Francisco Pizarro would exploit during his conquest. In North America, smallpox devastated indigenous populations from Florida to New England. The Pilgrims who arrived at Plymouth in 1620 settled in a region that had been depopulated by an epidemic, likely viral hepatitis or leptospirosis, between 1616 and 1619. William Bradford, the Plymouth colony's governor, wrote of finding skulls and bones were found in many places, lying still above the ground where their houses and dwellings had been, a very sad spectacle to behold. Smallpox was only the beginning. Measles arrived in the Americas in the 1530s, causing mortality rates that rivaled those of smallpox in populations without prior exposure. Typhus swept through Mexico in 1545, an outbreak that indigenous sources called cocolistli, meaning pestilence. Recent analysis of DNA from victims' teeth has identified the likely pathogen as Salmonella enterica, probably introduced from Europe. This epidemic may have killed 80% of Mexico's remaining indigenous population. Influenza, mumps, diphtheria, and whooping cough followed in succession. Each new disease struck populations already weakened by previous epidemics and by the social disruption of colonization. The cumulative effect was demographic collapse on a scale unprecedented in human experience. The mortality estimates for the Columbian exchange epidemics are necessarily approximate, given the absence of comprehensive population counts before European contact and the difficulty of separating deaths from disease from deaths due to warfare, enslavement, and starvation. However, the scholarly consensus is that indigenous American populations declined by between 80 and 95% during the first 150 years after contact. In Mexico, a population estimated at 15 to 25 million in 1519 had fallen to approximately 1.5 million by 1650. In Peru, a pre-contact population of perhaps 9 million declined to around 600,000 by the early 17th century. In what would become the United States, indigenous populations fell from an estimated 5 to 10 million in 1492 to fewer than 250,000 by the late 19th century. The death toll across the Western Hemisphere, calculated by subtracting the reduced populations from pre-contact estimates, ranges from approximately 56 million at the most conservative to upwards of 90 million using higher baseline figures. The epidemics did not affect all regions equally. Densely populated agricultural societies like those of Mexico and Peru experienced the highest mortality. Populations in the Amazon basin and other tropical lowlands, while devastated by disease, maintained somewhat greater continuity because their dispersed settlement patterns slowed transmission. Some isolated populations avoided contact with introduced diseases until much later. The Yanomami of the Amazon rainforest did not experience sustained European contact until the 20th century. When measles reached previously uncontacted Yanomami communities in the 1960s, it killed approximately 1/4 of those infected, demonstrating that the same immunological vulnerability that devastated 16th century populations persisted wherever populations remained unexposed. The demographic collapse of indigenous American populations had profound consequences for the subsequent history of the Western Hemisphere. Labor shortages in mines and on plantations led colonizers to intensify the transatlantic slave trade, forcibly transporting an estimated 12.5 million Africans to the Americas between 1500 and 1870. The depopulation of vast territories facilitated European territorial claims and settlement in ways that would have been far more difficult against populous and organized indigenous resistance. The ecological transformation of the Americas accelerated as abandoned agricultural lands reverted to forest and introduced European livestock multiplied across landscapes emptied of their human inhabitants. Some scientists have argued that the reforestation following indigenous population collapse was extensive enough to reduce global atmospheric carbon dioxide levels and contribute to the Little Ice Age of the 17th century. The question of intentionality has shaped interpretations of the Columbian exchange epidemics. The great majority of indigenous deaths resulted from diseases that spread without any deliberate action by Europeans, simply through the ordinary processes of human contact in a world newly connected by oceanic travel. Europeans did not understand germ theory and could not have deliberately deployed microbiological agents. However, this does not absolve colonial actors of responsibility for the context in which these epidemics occurred. Warfare, enslavement, forced labor, family separation, and the destruction of food systems all increased indigenous vulnerability to disease. And in some documented cases, Europeans did deliberately attempt to spread smallpox, In 1763, during Pontiac's War, British commanders at Fort Pitt distributed blankets from a smallpox hospital to Delaware emissaries. Geoffrey Amherst, the British commander-in-chief, wrote in correspondence, "Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among those disaffected tribes of Indians?" The Columbian Exchange epidemics rank 10th on our list, and first in terms of absolute mortality, with a death toll conservatively estimated at 56 million and potentially exceeding 90 million deaths. This represents the near-total destruction of entire civilizations and the deaths of approximately 10% of the global human population of the era. No other series of epidemics has killed more people in absolute terms. No other demographic event has so thoroughly reshaped the population geography of entire continents. The peoples of the Americas in 1492 were heir to thousands of years of cultural development, to architectural traditions, agricultural innovations, astronomical knowledge, and artistic achievements that had evolved entirely independently of the Eastern Hemisphere. The epidemics of the Columbian Exchange did not merely kill individuals, they destroyed worlds. The legacy of these epidemics remains visible today. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, though reduced to a fraction of their pre-contact populations, survived. Their descendants number in the tens of millions across the Western Hemisphere. Their languages, though many have been lost, continue to be spoken. Their cultures, though transformed by centuries of colonization, persist. In recent decades, indigenous communities have experienced demographic recovery, population growth, and cultural revitalization. The cities of the Americas, from Mexico City built atop Tenochtitlan to Lima, founded near Inca administrative centers, contain within them the layered histories of contact, catastrophe, and survival. The Columbian Exchange epidemics represent the single deadliest event in the recorded history of human disease, but they are not only a history of death, they are also a history of endurance. Closing. We have traveled across 3,000 years of human history, from ancient Rome to the present day. We have witnessed the Antonine Plague sweep through the legions of Marcus Aurelius and the cholera.